All right. So in 2019, I actually had the pleasure of meeting Charles Darwin. It was at the Museum of Natural History, right outside the Hall of Human Origins. Unfortunately, he had evolved into a stone, so he didn't listen to anything I was saying to him, and I really wanted to talk to him about that. So talk to him about his thoughts. So I'm going to go on without him tonight, and we're going to actually. The fact that that statue is in the Museum of Natural History, I think, sort of enlightens what our fundamental question is going to be, and we're going to find the answer to during these next 4 sessions. So is our origin, like the Hall of Human Origins, which has the little tracing of the monkey to the man, just merely this result of some natural process, or is it the culmination of some supernatural event, right? Did God create with scientific laws, or did he create these scientific laws? Are the scientific laws one of the things he created? And that's what we're going to talk about. So tonight, if you guys that are online, if you just want to throw your questions in the chat, we'll get to them at the end. You can just put them in there as we go, and then I'll leave time at the end for Q&A. Okay. Let me move this so you guys see better. All right, so G.K. Chesterton in the 1920s wrote a book called The Everlasting Man, and it was his answer to Darwin, right? And in his sort of human, his usual common sense manner, he reminds us that if we speak about prehistory, we have to remember what we actually mean when we say prehistoric man, right? It's called prehistory because we don't know anything about it, right? So strictly speaking, of course, we know nothing about prehistoric man for the simple reason that he was prehistoric. History of prehistoric man is a very obvious contradiction in terms. It is the sort of unreason in which only rationalists are allowed to indulge. Right? And so even he understood the way in which what he's calling rationalists use words. All right, so to speak of the history of prehistoric man. So here's the issue, right? If we're talking about prehistoric man, where he came from, his origins, all of that. What we know about prehistoric man, we can't use the scientific method the way we normally do, right? You can't suddenly just put creation, the act of creation, into a lab, and then spin up some experiment and get it to come out, right? And so there's one of 2 ways we can actually know something about prehistoric man. So it's a historical question, right? So the first way is we could rely on some sort of forensic science, which is what evolutionary biology is, right? So forensic science, it's not inherently invalid, although it tends towards, and we'll see a couple examples of this tonight, circular reasoning. So they say, well, what if this thing happened, right? Think about like police use forensics all the time, right? They'll say, okay, what if he really killed the man? And then they'll go and go, well, what did all these things, would have had to happen for him to do all these things, right? Even just the idea of like an alibi, right? And they would, okay, that assumption is wrong as an alibi, right? But you could see how if you start with the assumption that he killed the man, that you could easily come to that conclusion, right? And that's always going to be the danger in any forensic science like evolutionary biology. So a good example. Okay, so within evolution, there's this, or evolutionary biology, this thing called cladistics. How many of you guys have heard of cladistics? I don't know what cladistics is. All right, so cladistics is, it's a classification tool. Okay, so what they do is they take 2 species that have these, have something alike. And the more things they have alike, the closer they move them together so that they end up with some common ancestor, right? The problem with that, though, is that they don't actually know who the common ancestor is, right? And so they're assuming that they know that these things are actually related, right? So they're assuming if it has 4 hooves and runs at a trot, then it belongs over here. So it's this way of sort of classifying and putting things together, but there's really no proof, right? This is how we get things like dinosaurs with feathers on them, right? I think, well, if it's a transition species between birds and dinosaurs, it had to have feathers, even though they'll have no evidence that there are actually feathers there, right? And so you can see in some ways how they're assuming and what they're trying to prove, right? And so it really is prone to circular reasoning. And there's other parts of evolution that do that, and we're going to talk about another one in a minute with natural selection. But kind of go back to the question at hand, that if we can't necessarily reset up the act of creation, right? Like we can't put it in a laboratory, and so we have to use forensic science, or someone has to tell us about it, right? Someone has to tell us about it. Now, obviously, that's opening the way to divine revelation. And if someone has to tell us about it, and it's something far outside of our experience, we might expect that the language that's used might not really be something we're used to hearing, right? Or the explanation might not be something we're used to hearing, right? And we would expect that it would be a non-scientific explanation, because it can't be explained by science. It's not a natural question, it's a supernatural question, right? And so now we're back to where we were, where we're talking about was creating a supernatural event or a natural event, right? All right, before we do that though, what I want to do is, I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So what I want to do is back up for just a second and ask, why do we even care? Why do we even care about whether evolution is true or not? What does it have to do with our faith? What does it matter? All right, and so I think there's 4 reasons why we should care. All right, the first is a variation of this quote from Galileo. I've heard many people say, they'll say, well, the Bible's not a science textbook, right? And we already sort of addressed that a little bit. We said, well, no, it's not a science textbook, but was that even something that could be explained by science, right? And they'll say something to the fact of, well, it doesn't really matter, like how God created. All we care about is that He created, right? We don't really care about, the Bible doesn't need to tell us how the heavens go, just how to go to heaven, right? That's Galileo. And we often dismiss it, and we'll say things like, well, it's just mythical language explaining things. And mythical quickly becomes code word for false, right? Or made up, or imaginary. And then what happens? A little crack opens, right? A little crack opens, all right? And so now the first 2 chapters of Genesis are so-called myth, right? Well, yeah, now you've got the issue of Cain and Abel, and wait, who did they marry? Oh, Genesis 3 is thrown out. And wait a second, hold on. What about these mythical giant men who came down and mated with the women? Oh, and don't forget, we got to throw out the flood, because that would really mess everything up, because we're pretty much dependent on that. Sediment builds uniformly over time, right? That's how we measure everything. And so if the flood really happened, that's going to throw all our measurements off. Right? And so now we've done away with the first 10 chapters of Genesis. All right. And we've just now naturally explained everything from the very beginning. Well, then why does Jesus, why is he even who he says he is? Well, his miracles. What do we need? We don't need his miracles. We just need his teachings. Right? And you see how the crack opens and it just keeps going. Right? And there's no stopping it. Not surprisingly, if you open that crack, if you tear one thread off the seamless garment of the faith, everything else goes with it. Right? And so we should care about this, because this is the way that, in the 20th century, that sort of critical biblical scholarship has destroyed faith. Right? Evolution was the crack in which it opened. And so once you've thrown all those out, evolution didn't just replace a scientific theory. It didn't just replace one scientific theory with another, but it wiped away everything, right? You ask someone 200 years ago how old the Earth was, they'd say 6,000 to 9,000 years. The Earth ages 150 years later, and now they've added millions and millions, if not billions of years, all right? And we're going to talk about why that's false, but not tonight, but we're still going to talk about it. And I mean, the second part of this is really important, is how the heavens move actually matters. It actually matters. Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. Why do the heavens move in the way they move? Why would they move that way? Why did God do anything the way he did it? To reveal himself to us, right? To show his glory, right? So that we could come to know him. So the other fallout, not surprisingly, which has hurt the church, is the sacramental view of reality has just went out, right? Everything is mechanistic, everything is measured, everything is predicted, and no longer do things have meaning anymore, right? And the example, I always use the same example about if I ask the question, why does the moon orbit the earth? Right? Well, why does the moon orbit the earth? And someone will always say, well, the gravitational pull forces acting against each other. But that's how, right? And we've substituted how for why, right? Because God could have done it a billion other ways. Why does he do it that way? Right? Because it's meant to reveal something about us, right? And so it absolutely matters how he created, right? And how his creation works matters too. That's why the church was always at the forefront of science, right? It wasn't because technology gave us power. It was because knowledge gave us more love, right? Knowledge gave us more love of God. And so the church always cared about science, and that's why it was at the forefront, right? And the church has to step back into that role. And again, we'll come back to that. All right. So the other sort of reason that this matters, often we're told, well, truth cannot contradict truth. So we're saying, okay, well, evolution is true, so then all these other truths have to follow. All right. Let's think about for a second, if evolution is really true, what truths follow. Darwin in Origin of Species says, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selective variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. All right, so you'll recognize that is as his survival of the fittest, right? That's what he's talking about. So what are the consequences of believing that, though? What are the actual consequences, right? So if it's true, if it is something that is at really the base of reality, right? How can you argue that racism is wrong, for example? Right? Some races are evolutionarily further along than other races. There's no argument that you can give me to tell me racism is wrong, other than maybe you just don't like it right now. Right? And in fact, not surprisingly, you could go down the line to, Stalin, Mao, Hitler, all of them loved Darwin for this reason, right? They all loved Darwin for this reason. All right. Let's go a little deeper, all right, into what he has to say. Some future period, not very distant. All right, so just the background here. I actually didn't put the quote in here. So what Darwin did is he wrote The Origin of Species, which is about evolution in the animal world, right? But he just kind of left dangling whether it applied to human beings, right? And that's when he comes back years later and writes the Descent of Man, right? And those names ought to strike something in us, right? Like the descent of man. Man goes down, not up, right? So it's dragging down. And so here's what happens when in the Descent of Man, he applies his principles to human beings. He says at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, not very distant, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, like the gorilla, orangutan, or chimpanzee, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be either rendered wider for what intervenes between man in a more civilized state, as we hope, than Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So he is essentially saying that races are not equal, right? So, okay, so now we're throwing one more thing out, right? We're throwing out the dignity of man, right? We're throwing out that man is made in the image of God, and he's now made in the image of King Kong, right? So we've now moved to another move towards away from the faith. But what happens with this, though, if it really is survival of the fittest, that really is the animating principle of reality. That's morality. Morality is just whatever helps people to survive, right? Morality is whatever helps groups of people, right? It's no longer about the individual, right? Because evolution works on the level of species, right? That's its sort of unit. And so it's morality, and Darwin is honest about this in The Descent of Man. Morality is whatever is convenient for whoever's in power, right? Whoever is moving evolution along, whatever they deem to be moral is moral, right? Might makes right. And this is why his sons and his grandchildren were the movers in the eugenics movement, right? Where they tried to take humans who were less than human in their eyes and move them back. Get rid of them, right? They would try to sterilize them, whatever. So again, if evolution is true, racism, genocide isn't wrong. Okay, there's no way you can argue that. And so now we've moved now to the abolition of the natural law. Natural law is gone too, right? Because nature, red in tooth and claw. That's it. There is no such thing as human nature. We're going to talk about that in a minute when we get to his discussion of species. Now, is it unfair to blame Darwin for this? Right? He comes up with this theory. He doesn't necessarily carry it to its logical conclusion. And I think it is. And here's why. Darwin came from a long line of abolitionists, right? Hated slavery, right? He's friends with William Wilberforce, and his son Samuel. And after he writes The Descent of Man, Samuel Wilberforce, William Wilberforce's son, sends him a letter, and he says, "Do you realize what this will open Pandora's box to?" And he tells him he will open it. It'll open to racism, right? It will open to slavery. But Darwin hated God so much that he wasn't willing to relent. Right? He wanted to find a way to do away with God. Right? And so what did he try to do? Well, he had read Voltaire, and Voltaire says is never attack the church directly. Never attach it, always go through a side door. Right? And he, in one of his letters, he talks about this. He said, I read this in Voltaire, and Voltaire was right. So he tried to make a side door in to attack the church, and he got in. And so what he did was, well, he kind of calmed his own conscience. He said, there was an instinct for this benevolent sympathy that ought to make us not do things like enslave people. But again, while simultaneously kind of pushing for nature red in tooth and claw, it's kind of hard to make that stick. All right. So can any of those truths be reconciled with truths of the faith? Anything I just said, right? Just those were one step away, right? And we could play the game and we could go another step. So maybe there's something more going on. So one of the reasons why I even got interested in this is because anytime I ever heard someone make a creationist argument, make an argument about young Earth, I never heard an argument against it. I'd always hear people scoffing at them or laughing at them, and you would get the same now. And that really intrigued me because I'm like, why aren't they actually answering their objections, right? I mean, if evolution is true, they can handle it, right? They can handle, people asking stupid questions. So why was that? And the reason is St. Peter, a prophecy of St. Peter's, which You may already know about this, but I kind of found it along the same, about the same time that I started really kind of asking that question. St. Peter says, first of all, you must understand this. So he's talking about the end times. That scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own passions and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. Right, so that's what they're saying. That's what the scoffers are saying. All things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. They deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God, heavens existed long ago. By the word of God, right? How did it come about? And an earth formed out of water, and by means of water, through which the world that then existed was deluged with water. So the scoffers will throw out the worldwide flood and perish. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist have been stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment, destruction of ungodly men. So the thing that they're scoffing about is evolution. The thing they're talking about is, they say, forever since the fathers fell asleep, all things have continued as they were from the beginning. There's nothing else. No other theory says that, right? And does that mean that, like, you know, Antichrist is going to be here next week? No, that's not what he means by that, right? He just means that it's going to be at the heart of the spirit of the Antichrist, all right? So all throughout history, you know, there's been this battle, you know, the spirit of Christ versus the spirit of the Antichrist, right? And towards the end, there was going to be something like this, all right? And in a lot of ways, as Catholics, we ought to grasp this pretty easily. We ought to see this and really hesitate to just jump right on board. All right, so the other objection that needs to be addressed, I think, is sort of the accusation of staying in your own lane. Like, what qualifies me to talk about this? Why should the church say anything about evolution? Now, I would say, first of all, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but neither is Darwin. Right? Darwin had a degree in theology. I have a degree in theology. He was a naturalist, right? So he studied natural history. So we sort of throw that objection away a little bit, and especially in an age where we have like the cult of the expert, where no one can question the experts, right? The problem is that if we don't question the experts, their worldview gets sort of snuck in the back door, right? In the end, materialism or secularism, whatever you want to call it, naturalism relies on evolution to prop it up. Okay, if Darwin is wrong, then secularism is wrong. Okay, if God really did create everything we see, then we owe him something. And it really, in the truth, right? What Darwin and his sort of intellectual progeny are doing is they're playing like armchair philosophers, right? They're trying to take their philosophy and they're trying to smuggle it in science, right? Why are they so sold on evolution? Well, because it's the best explanation if I throw out God, right? That's all they got. That's all they can cling to, right? Is if evolution is false, there's nothing they can do, right? And so that's why we have to be careful about giving into them. So John Paul II, when he gave an address, which we will come back to next week when we talk about the church, to the Academy of Sciences on evolution, he said that the church takes a direct interest in the question of evolution because it touches on the conception of man, whom Revelation tells us is created in the image and likeness of God. Okay, so why should we care about evolution? All right, it's because it creates an existential crisis. Right? The four questions everyone has: where did I come from? Why am I here? How should I live? What happens when I die? Right? Does the church answer all four of those questions? Yes. Does evolution answer all four of those questions? Yes, right? Do they end up in the same place? Not even close, right? All of them are opposite to what the church would say, right? All right, so let's step back and kind of look from like the 30,000 foot view about this, over this, okay? All right, so what is science? We use the term science. So we're going to go through, we're going to define our terms. All right, so science is an organized body of knowledge based on first principles and whose primary purpose is to seek the knowledge of causes. All right, so there's three aspects of the definition, right? There's an organized body of knowledge. It has some first principles upon which it depends to even start, right? And its purpose is to investigate causes. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the philosophy of evolution. But the notion that there's four causes of a thing will tell you what the thing is, all right? And that's essentially what a science is meant to do, reveal what a thing is. But the important part is that every science has to have some functional or some foundational truth that it takes as a given, okay? And in order to proceed, right? So where do we get these first principles? Well, there's a hierarchy of the sciences, all right? And the lower ones get them from the ones above, all right? And the hierarchy is based upon the object, what the thing is trying to study, right? And so what the thing studies and how actually matters, okay? So the highest science, because it pertains to God, would be theology and natural theology. So the difference only being natural theology being where you can get with human reason. So that would be, the formal object would be human reason, where the material object is God. And then theology, you could just has to do with divine revelation, so what God revealed, okay? And then you have metaphysics, which studies being as a whole, all right? And then under metaphysics, you have the philosophy of nature, which studies the properties of matter, all right? And it studies them through the fundamental causes, right? So it looks at things like the nature of change, like, which is really important for evolution, right? Like it says one thing changes into another. Okay, well, what are the rules of change, right? So if you're going to posit that something changed from one thing to another, you have to have some first principles to tell you what those changes look like. What makes, if I break the screen on the projector, right? I've changed the projector in some way, but it's still the projector, right? If I take all of the insides out and put a back on it and make it into a chair, I've made it something different, okay? And so the first would be just an accidental change. And then the second would change the nature of the thing, change the essence of it. It would be, or substance, it would be a substantial change, right? And so we have to have rules for understanding how those changes happen. What is the object in which it changes? What's the thing? Like in a change, there has to be something that's held constant, right? And all of that, right? So empirical science depends upon that, all right? Because empirical science is trying to sort of study matter, material objects, but through the lens of accidents, through that lens of what it looks like, all right? And can we get to what's sort of underlying by getting what it looks like, right? And so what happens is the philosophy of nature borrows from metaphysics for its first principles, right? Metaphysics borrows from natural theology for its first principles, right? And then divine revelation, everything in it is a first principle, right? It's a given, right? That's the definition of revelation, right? And so once we can sort of apply this to the question of evolution, and which is what we're going to do each of the next 3 weeks, each of the next 3 times we meet, we're going to find out that when we look at theology, that which is the first we'll look at, that evolution is completely untenable. And if we look at metaphysics, we're going to find out it's metaphysically impossible. And then when we actually look at the science itself, we're going to find that it's dubious, not surprising, right? Because the way science should be done is if one of your answers to a question is metaphysically impossible, you don't waste your time, right? You don't waste your time trying to figure out the answer. All right, so let's look at the theory itself, okay? And I'm sort of summarizing here, but I think these sort of 5 steps captures it. All right, so the theory of evolution posits common descent with modification. That consists in 5 components, all right? Life itself is a result of continuing evolutionary processes. So everything is constantly in flux, all right? As opposed to a stable world. Second principle is common descent. The third is gradual development from one species to another over a long period of time, right? So you can imagine, again, going back to what I said, that if it turns out that the Earth really is only 11,000 years old, say, evolution crumbles, right? Because all of these gradual developments from one species to another has to happen over a really long period of time because it's just little changes that somehow accumulate. Its mechanism is natural selection, and we're going to talk about what that is in a second. And it operates, even though its fundamental unit is species, through variant individuals. So you can think in terms of mutations, okay? So these mutant individuals are the ones who introduce something new into the gene pool that then natural selection sort of selects on, all right? I mean, and it's important too, like the sort of the generic idea of evolution, and we'll talk more about this next time, that's not new. Darwin didn't come up with that. That has been, the fathers of the church knew about it, right? What he came up with and why it's sort of always attributed to him, he came up with the mechanism by which it works. Right? He came up with what he thought was the mechanism by which it works. And so that mechanism is completely natural, right? All the other sort of ideas of supernatural in some way it had something to do with the deity, right? What's important then, not so much is the fact that the mechanisms themselves, but that it's a purely natural process, right? So an attempt to change 2,000 years of understanding of it being a supernatural process into a natural process. All right, so let's keep going for some more definition. So obviously, if we want to talk about evolution, we should define it, right? Evolution literally means unfolding, all right? Which kind of assumes that there's some sort of like earlier existence in the thing, like a seed or something, and so in which it sort of unfolds. Okay, so let's see what Darwin said. He said, when we descend to details, we can prove that no one species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. Nor can we explain why some species have changed and others have not. And this isn't something he wrote like at the beginning. Right? This is at the end. He says we can't explain any of these things. We can't explain why a species has changed, why another one didn't. We can't even talk about maybe the changes are beneficial, maybe they're not. And you know what? We still can't. Right? We still can't. And again, we'll come back to that. I'm not just going to throw that out there. But what I want to get at is what often happens is what I'll call a bait and switch, an evolutionary bait and switch. And what I mean by that is, if you read The Origin of Species, you'll see he has example after example after example of what he calls transformism. He didn't use the word evolution initially. And he's basically talking about microevolution. We call microevolution, right? We're going to call that limited variation, right? And in fact, he even uses, very interestingly, in the beginning, he uses as one of his examples, artificial selection, like so people growing plants as his example, right? But he never really gets to whether actually those little small steps have a limit to them, whether they stop, right? And he has no examples of one species turning to another. And that's, we're going to call that evolution. And that's what I mean when I say evolution. So often what happens is like, hey, look, there's this bacteria that now antibiotic resistant. Clearly evolution is a thing, right? Well, depends on what you mean by evolution, right? The fact that there are some individuals in that particular species of bacteria that are antibiotic resistant, and you give antibiotic and suddenly they're growing because they're not getting killed by the antibiotics, doesn't tell us anything. It just tells us the ratio changed, right? Nothing was created in that, right? One didn't just suddenly go, now I'm antibiotic resistant. That they were already there. All right. So that's one of the issues with evolution, right? Is it's not a creative process at all, right? It just changes the ratio. All right. And that part is really, really important. All right. All right. So let's talk about the word species then. So interestingly enough, you guys catch though, I think this is probably important, that the title of his book, right? What is another word for origin? Genesis, right? So he's trying to usurp Moses, right? So he's trying to come up with the origin of species. All right, so it's really important then that you be able to define what you're working with, right? So let's see how he defines species, and then we'll see if we can define it better. From these remarks, it will be seen that I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and it does not essentially differ from the term variety. So he's saying it's just species is a mental construct that we just came up with to make it convenient so that when we have things that have variety to them, if they're variable enough, then we can call them something different. That shouldn't sit real well with us, right? Like, first of all, he says it's arbitrary, but then he says that it does not essentially, as an essence, differ from the term variety. So he's made these two terms synonymous. So he's saying really species just means something that has more variability to it. And the fact that if you do not define what a species is, guess what you don't need to worry about? The difference between micro and macro evolution, right? I mean, if you just arbitrarily say that's a new species, well, evolution just happened, right? And that's pretty much across the gamut what happens, right? Can we say that from a zebra or from a horse to a zebra is a new species? Maybe, maybe not. Can we say that from a whale to an alligator, are they separate species? We'd say, yeah, almost definitely, right? And so, but he doesn't really concern himself with that. All he does is just says, okay, if they're different enough in appearance in some way, then they're different species, and we can sort of arbitrarily come up with that. And so what it sits upon, and it's really important to understand, to grasp this, because we're going to talk about it when we talk about man. Everything in reality for him is just differences in degrees, right? There's no differences in kind, right? And sort of understand the difference, right? A difference of degree would be, I have 2 cups of water in front of me, and one has more in it. They're both the same thing. There's just an accidental difference that one has more in it, right? But if I have a cup of water and a cup of beer, then those 2 things are essentially different, right? They're different in kind, not different in degree, right? And so what Darwin posits is that everything is just a difference in degree, right? Everything just sort of builds on top of what came before it. The scientific definition of species is just as problematic, right? So the scientific definition of species normally is whether 2 things can breed, right? Well, what about asexual beings? What about parthenogenetic species that reproduce, like bees, right? They reproduce males, and then only the fertilized eggs reproduce females, right? So how do we determine then what are separate species, right? So there has to be something more to it, right? And often when you begin to talk about this, they will say, well, there's species are different because they can breed. And it's just as arbitrary as the term species, right? Now, the natural question is, okay, how does the notion of species connect to in Genesis in the beginning when it talks about God creating kinds, right? There's some relationship there, but we have to be careful not to make it exactly those things exactly the same, right? Whether something is how many kinds of animals God created, we don't really know, right? But certainly there are different kinds of animals, which means they have different natures, which means not everything is a difference in degree, right? There actually are difference in kinds. All right, along the same lines, remember when I said earlier about the danger of circular reasoning? So C.H. Waddington is a early 20th century evolutionary biologist, and he had this to say about Darwin. So Darwin's major contribution was, of course, the suggestion that evolution can be explained by the natural selection of random variations. Natural selection, which was at first considered as though it were a hypothesis that was in need of experimental or observational confirmation. Notice that at first it was that, but now it's not that anymore. It doesn't need experimental or observational confirmation. Turns out on closer inspection to be a tautology. This is why. A statement of an inevitable but previously unrecognized relation. It states that the fittest individuals in a population will leave the most offspring. The fact in no way reduces the magnitude of Darwin's achievement. Only after it was clearly formulated could biologists realize the enormous power of the principle as a weapon of explanation. So what's a tautology? Right? Tautology is when you say something like that's evidently true in and of itself, right? So, let's just use the example of the survival of the fittest, right? So what does it mean to survival of the fittest? What does that mean?
Those with the best genes get to survive and pass their genes on.
Yeah. So, but what does fittest mean? Like what makes something fit?
It gets to survive and pass its genes on.
Okay. But does that mean, so let's look at a horse, right? So let's say a horse, that there's a horse that really runs fast. That horse more fit than the slower horses.
It depends. Does it pass its genes on?
Exactly. Right. So the fittest is the one who reproduces the most. Right. That doesn't seem to really matter then, right? Right. Why just because something passes its genes on, right? What makes that other than the fact that it has the most? Why does that have to be the best? In fact, maybe the slowest horse actually does it because he can't run away from the mares in heat, right? Like, so how does that make the species better? Like now you've got a bunch of slow horses. How does that make the species any better? Right. So the reason why it's a tautology then is it basically just says that the fittest are the fittest, right? It doesn't explain anything. Right? It doesn't explain why that the slower horse was the one who reproduced the most. And yet somehow horses get faster or something, right? Like none of that gets explained. Yes. Right, but that's not. But that doesn't tell us any. Like that doesn't have anything to do with survival of the fittest, right? So the safety from predators has nothing. He could have impregnated 700 horses, and he's the slowest, and he got eaten. So what? You see what I'm saying? Like it doesn't matter. It doesn't. The point is not that it's not that anything's wrong. It just doesn't explain anything, right? It doesn't explain why those genes actually still survive, right? And that's why it just kind of repeats itself, right? Like if I ask you, okay, why, how explain to me how man came from an ape. And you just say, well, the ape with the most offspring had the most offspring. That's what you just told me. That's all you told me, right? It was because the ape with the most offspring. So there has to be another explanation, right? The point is he grabbed that common sense thing and tried to turn it into an explanation that doesn't actually explain what's going on. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me, right? That the fastest animal would be the one that would outrun its predators, and they're likely to survive. But if they're so fast that the mares can't catch up to them, then they haven't done anything, right? So the point is it's not an explanation. And nor does it actually establish that that anything will change, right? So what if it's changing just enough to stay the same? Right? What if it's, what if the horse just gets a little bit faster? And ultimately everything stays the same, right? Like I look at the balance of different phenotypes and genotypes in the population, they're exactly the same. And the horse got a little bit faster, but it stayed exactly the same, right? So it doesn't tell me anything, right? And that's the sort of thing that evolution is hanging its hat on, right? That we have to be aware of. And so Chesterton, when he sort of summarizes the origin of species, again, in his usual sort of way, mentions that there's a certain irony, right? That it's called the origin of species, and it neither explains what a species is or actually says where anything came from. He said, okay, one thing comes, this moth turned into another moth, fine. This, bird turned into another bird, fine. But he doesn't ever say, how did the bird get there? How did the first bird get there, right? That would be an interesting question. That would be about the origin of the species. He's just trying to tell me how one species becomes another. All right, and so Chesterton says, nobody can imagine how nothing could turn into something, right? So this is the big question. How did we get something? Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the question of origin, right? That's not the question evolution actually answers, right? Like that is a big question not to have answered when you claim to have the answer, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Nobody can imagine how nothing could turn into something. Nobody can get an inch nearer to it by explaining how something could turn into something else, right? It is really far more logical to start by saying, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Even if you only mean in the beginning, some unthinkable power began some unthinkable process. For God is by its nature a name of mystery. And nobody ever supposed that man could imagine how a world was created any more than he could create one. But evolution really is mistaken for explanation. It has the fatal quality of leaving on many minds the impression that they do understand it and everything else, just as many of them live under a sort of illusion that they have read the origin of species. All right. So the irony is that it explains neither origin nor species. All right, which is, most people would say, okay, that book was a failure. Right. All right, so I want to talk about two more things, and then we can open up for questions. And this has to do with what I'll call compromises. All right. Now, if everything I've said tonight is true, and I'm going to prove it next 3 times we meet, if everything I said is true, why would we make any compromises with evolution, right? It clearly goes one way and faith goes the other, all right? And we'll see which one we think is true by the time we get done. But there's this habit of making compromises, right? And some of it is back to what I said about sort of being deluded that the science is actually way more sure than it actually is, right? And then there's also just, not wanting to look foolish, right? So let's talk about at least one of those compromises, and that's what we're going to call theistic evolution. So God guided evolution. And there's one sort of floating theory around that, in essence, if I summarize it, it says God created by evolution and is more glorified in using secondary causes. Right? And this principle comes from Thomas Aquinas, and it comes from the Summa Contra Gentiles. So that no creature has any active role in the production of any effect, much is detracted from the creature and from God the creator. Okay, so if creatures don't actually do anything, if they don't actually somehow contribute, if they don't act, or if they're not actually the cause of things, then that not only takes away from them as creatures, but also from the creator, right? Kind of makes sense, right? Now, this sort of this compromise, I think, if we back up just a second and think about evolutionists or humanists, whatever you want to call them, they're not stupid, right? They want to take a divide and conquer approach, right? This is why the scoffing happens, by the way, right? So if they can get, Christians to argue and be on different pages about evolution, for example, they've already won, right? They've already won, right? Because now there's a group of, we'll call them enlightened Christians who go, well, yeah, evolution is true, and here's how you got to adjust the reading of the Bible. Here's what else you've got to adjust. And they go, and we're not like those fundamentalists over there, right? And so this is why you don't make compromises, right? So anyway, so this compromise essentially is saying, well, yeah, God created, but he used evolution to create. Right? And I think we probably have all heard this. And it's essentially, if you sort of read St. Thomas, it's an argument from what's called fittingness, right? Like it's more fitting to God to use secondary causes than to do everything himself. But it sort of makes a fundamental mistake in its sort of logic. And we're going to talk about this next week when we talk about, there's the order of creation, which right now we'll call this first 6 days, right? And on the seventh day, providence takes over, all right? And in the sort of the part of providence, on the part of providence, we would say that, totally lost my train of thought. So in providence, that this rule applies, right? There are times when it brings God more glory to use secondary causes than to do it himself. But what they sort of do is absolutize this, right? So not only new order creation, but would it give God more glory if he had, if Jesus had Thomas bring the temple tax and hand it to Peter, just using a secondary cause? Would that give God more glory than the fact that Jesus miraculously put the coin in the fish's mouth? Which gives God more glory? Well, the one he did, right? We already know that, right? But he didn't use the secondary cause, right? So something like, so this sort of idea is that somehow miracles don't apply, right? God supernaturally acting in his creation or on his creation or creating it doesn't even factor into it, right? And so that there are other forms of divine causality than just through secondary causes. God does act as primary cause plenty of times, right? The sun danced at Fatima. Right? There's no secondary cause of that. Right? And in fact, St. Thomas actually said, if we're sort of thorough on this, and this is where he makes the distinction between creation and providence. All right, and we're going to do this a lot, where we talk about creation, where God created everything, including scientific laws, and then providence, where those scientific laws, among other things, start to take over. So St. Thomas says, creation is more perfect and excellent than generation and alteration. What does that mean? So he's saying creating out of nothing, only God can do, is more perfect and excellent than generation and alteration. That's what we do, right? We generate, we alter. Because the term whereto is the whole substance of the thing, whereas what is understood as the term wherefrom is simply not being. So what he's saying is God makes the entire thing, right? He just modify things, right? So if God wants to modify something, he'll use a secondary cause. God wants to create, which only God can do. Only God can create out of nothing. Then only God can do that. All right, and we're going to talk about why that is in just a second. So evolution falls under which category there? Yeah. So he says, hence, nothing else can act positively, instrumentally to this effect. So he's talking about, can something create out of nothing? Can a thing create out of nothing? Right? Well, God can do a lot of things, but he can't create something that can create out of nothing. You know why? Because that's nonsense, right? What do you get from nothing? Can God create nothing? Nothing is not a thing, right? So you're essentially saying that God can create nothing that produces something out of its own power, right? That's what they're saying when they say that. Right? When they're saying it's sort of folded up in creation is evolution. That God can create a nothing that produces something. Right? That's makes no sense, right? And so God doesn't deal in nonsense. All right. All right. So the next time we meet, we're going to talk about the theological arguments against evolution. And then 2 weeks after that, when we meet, we'll talk about the philosophical arguments against it. And then we'll talk about, and the last time we'll talk about scientific arguments against it. And then sort of talk about why the science isn't quite as stable as it appears to be. All right, who has questions? All right, so I will, there's a couple on the chat. So does evolution necessarily lead to the acceptance of nominalist framework? Yes, because so nominalism says that nothing has nature, right? It's just, we just give them names. That's where the term nominalist comes from, because it's convenient for us to talk about them or to categorize them or group them. So yeah, so evolution comes right out of a sort of nominalist framework. And it also requires, which we'll talk about the philosophy, it also requires looking at the world through like the eyes of a Cartesian sort of understanding, where reality is really in my head and everything else outside doesn't matter. Isn't the point of survival of the fittest that the horse would be just fast enough to get away from predators, but also evolve along the mares that can keep up with the horse to mate with? I don't know. It could be in certain situations, but in other situations it might not be that case at all, right? So we have to come up with some definition of fittest, or perhaps the fast horse is fittest because it can get away from the predators, so that next mating season it will be alive and can have more offspring. So the slow horse will have less offspring because it is not alive long enough to do so. It could outrun all the predators, but had it not been able to outrun the predators, maybe predators would have ate less of them, and then there would have been more mate the next season, right? So again, there's all these, and this is what evolutionary biology does, by the way, like these imaginative situations where, again, that's what a forensic science does. I mean, I'm not poo-pooing that science part of it, but it's all supposed, right? And it all depends on the situation. Totally depends on the situation. All right, other questions?
I think what Rob's getting at is that the whole concept of survival of the fittest requires circular reasoning of some sort, because you're asking, okay, what does it actually mean? What does it fundamentally mean to be the fittest, right? And that's really dependent fundamentally on whether you survive long enough to pass down your genes. Okay, and using backwards logic, you say, okay, so what passes down my genes then must mean that the individual is fittest. So like Rob said, it's kind of circular reasoning in the way that you have two terms which definitions depend on each other. So in your example, yes, in this specific circumstance, it does sound like being a faster horse might be more advantageous. But perhaps in another environment, being a faster horse is actually bad because it requires additional energy consumption and food is relatively scarce. So it doesn't matter if you can run fast. If you can't survive the cold winters with low food, you're basically screwed.
I miss you, Sharby.
Thank you. I miss you too.
Yeah, what he said. Other questions? If nominalism is all about convenience, should we ascribe to what should we ascribe to? What should we ascribe to binomial nomenclature and taxonomy? So natural science, empirical science, whatever you want to call it, does that, right? Like it's trying to create categories of things. In and of itself, it's not necessarily nothing wrong with it, right? Like that's how we come to know natures of things by their accidents as we categorize them and classify them. So in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. But if we assume that reality actually works like that we've got it exactly right, that, again, using my example, that the horse and the zebra actually have two different natures, or they're two different species, or two different kinds, using the biblical language. But we may not be able to get there, right? So, so it's definitely helpful. But what often happens is, well, we'd say, okay, well, mammals, somehow, humans and whales, because they're mammals, must have some distant relative somewhere. That's when it starts to get a little dicey. All right, other questions? Yes.
Darwin's underlying philosophy, but simply because one has a false premise doesn't always invalidate the conclusion that one can draw. And so one may have had some false underlying philosophies, it doesn't necessarily mean that all those conclusions are false. In modern day sense, you might say, I don't know if I necessarily agree with the cosmology of Grayson Tyson, but I don't have to accept his philosophies to accept what he's developed in that area. The same way with Charles Darwin. So maybe, yeah, he did envision philosophies where these things could exist, but I don't have to take his philosophies.
No, so just because somebody has their premises are incorrect or wrong doesn't mean that their conclusion is necessarily wrong. I totally agree with that. But what it does mean is that they haven't proven, right? So remember, we're starting from evolution as a fact, right? And so, so most of what, especially now, most of what I'm trying to do, I probably should have said this at the beginning, is to go, this is not a fact, right? And then I'm going to show why it's not even tenable. But yet you're exactly right. Just because his conclusion doesn't follow from his premises doesn't necessarily make his conclusion. It just makes it unproven, right? And we can show why. If, for example, I can take first principles and show why his conclusions are wrong, right? Which is what we're going to sort of do, and that's the approach I'm saying. But you're totally right. Like I can make a conclusion that's true, and have an invalid argument, or have premises that aren't true, but I just haven't proven it, right? That doesn't make it untrue. That's not a question. Okay, Aaron.
I guess I'm just confused. If you look at Darwin's finches, even if it was for a limited period of time, the environment forced a specific type of meat to survive. That kind of, I feel would show limited variation. You're calling microevolution. So I guess I don't understand what the circular reasoning with the most fittest.
Yeah. So go back to your example with the beak length, right? You're just looking at one aspect of, you're saying, okay, the beak length is what may enable them to survive. Is that all that enabled them to survive? And just because they survived, were they the most, suppose that there's 1,000 of them and 999 are short-beaked, but the one long-beaked actually is a ladies' man, right? And he has a ton of offspring, right? Well, who has the largest, who is the most fit of that group? He's not adapted to the environment at all by that standard, right? There's no adaptation in his part, right? But he is now actually the most reproductively fit, right? And so really what it all comes down to is any definition of fitness is really reproductive fitness. That's it. Like, it's hard to go from anything else than that, right? Which is why, like, Darwin's offspring understood that, and that's why they were so adamant about sterilization, right? Because they're like, these poor, disgusting people won't stop having kids, right? Like, this is the heart of Margaret Sanger. This is what she believed, and it started there, right? And so, because she saw, she's like, wait, they're having kids, they're having 10 kids. Like, we can't let that. It's bad for the race. You know, the Negro is having 10 children. That's bad for humanity. Like, that's her logic, and it comes straight from Darwin, right? That's survival of the fittest. Like, she understood, okay, it's really reproductive survival that matters. Maybe it might be an explanation, but it's definitely an incomplete explanation, right?
I just wanted to say, when you were talking about it the first time, all the survival of the fittest, abortion came up.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's totally it.
Right away when you said that, and I'm so glad you addressed that with her. So
that is totally where, I mean, that's where the mentality comes from. No. What we have intellectual justification then. That's what it is. Maybe. I mean, that's fine, but in a culture that's scientifically oriented, or I mean, I'll just that's soft enough. When science tells you can do something, then you can do it. Okay, so yeah, so what you're saying is that people sinned, right? But here's what's unique about it, right? Is that those people, for the most part, did something that the society thought was reprehensible, right? You call it reprehensible. Okay, well, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. I would just say that I don't think that when that happened, they were going around bragging about it the way people brag about abortion. I don't think so. I think that by sterilizing it the way that we do, I think it's a totally different thing, and I think it's because there's a scientific justification behind it. I mean, I totally understand you disagree with that. I don't dispute that people have done that for ages upon ages. I don't dispute that, that the Didache talks about abortion. I don't dispute that the Romans used to leave their children to be exposed. I don't dispute any of that. What I do dispute is that anyone who, I don't think consciences were deadened the way that they are now. Like, I think if you can rationalize and intellectually justify something, and you have a reason for doing it versus your own personal reason, right? Like, I don't want this child is deformed, versus, oh no, it's okay to do this. I think that's the new part, honestly, because I don't think anyone, I don't think it was promoted and pushed the way it is now. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think that when they would expose their children, that it was a thing that they would go back and brag to their friends about the way they do now. Yes.
Could the argument that regardless of whether it was bragged about or not, they both have led to the same error, which is the loss of the dignity of man, the inherent dignity of man, such that whether they did it because they just kind of purely in survivalist terms, or whether they did it because they had an evolutionary justification. The point being, the error is the loss of the inherent dignity of man, and therefore that error can still be found. However you get the error is wrong both ways.
Yeah, so Connor's question is, I realized I wasn't repeating the question. So Connor's question is, either way, can we just say that the error was just an attack on the dignity of a person? And the answer to that question is yes, right? The point at all times, right? That's always the case. That is always the case. But if you call it a post-Christian society, then there's a post-Christian attack on it. And that's really what it comes down to.
Uniqueness is that it's a scientific approach that justifies to a post-Christian world why it's okay to be the science.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's propped up. Will I be addressing radiocarbon dating or fossilization or other methods that state their evidence? Yes. Most likely in the last talk. Could you explain more on how evolution describes man's nature and how that's different from our dignity of being created in the image of God? So the question is, first, evolution would say man doesn't have a nature. There are no really such things as natures. Man is just more advanced than his ancestor, some ape ancestor. Darwin very deliberately titled the book Descent of Man, because he was bringing man back down to the material level. So the dignity of being created in the image of God that's not really in that. That would not be a part of his sort of understanding. All right, other questions?
And you run away from the nurse soon and then inches, but it'd be like long week burn in an area where having to shoot at the review. Biologically, that's not what tends to happen because like animals have the instinct to mate. So the males tend to realize, oh, I need to do this. Or the females see, okay, who's getting more food? I want my babies to be able to get more food. And will tend toward like the faster because you get to run away, but you still have those instincts to come back to mate, or the ones with the wider beak because they see, okay, like maybe he's not the prettiest, but like he's got a beak that's thick enough that can actually open the nuts, and that's what matters.
It can be an explanation, but there's so many counter examples too, right? Like you gave me a situation where the beak was advantageous, but that may not actually, the beak may have nothing to do with whether they survive or not, right? So there's no way until you can explain to me other than the one who has the most babies is the fittest. Like we initially think, well, it's the most muscular guy, or whatever it is, right? But we have to have a better definition than that because that's not always the case, right? It's not always the one who's best adapted to the environment, whatever that means. I don't know what it means for an individual to truly thrive in an environment. It's not always him that sends his genes along, right?
You're asking for a universal definition for fitness aside.
I think if it's a principle upon which you're going to build something, you have to have, just like species, right? Like why, if you're saying that really species is meaningless, then why bother even talking about evolution? Like you've really said something we already knew. Things change. And sometimes they change in ways that they look a little different or look more different. That doesn't, see, the thing is like, you have to get at the heart of what questions they're really answering and why those questions are really interesting, other than you've put some sort of mechanism in place that gets rid of God, right? Like, I don't know any other reason why, if I don't have a definition, of what constitutes a change, why I would study change. And why would I study something that's random? Do certain, like, other than saying they look alike, like that doesn't really tell if they've changed, right? So I think if you go back to the roots of it, you got to come up with a good foundation for a science, right? What are the first principles? Well, they said the first principle is survival of the fittest. Well, what is that? What does that mean? I don't know. And no one could, I mean, you can't tell me the answer to the question, right? Because it's not helpful to actually, and then, okay, so the other principle, what the principle of, okay, so species change. Some principle of change. Well, what does a change look like? I don't know, right? So to me, it doesn't, there's something more going on there that doesn't actually answer the questions that it says it answers. Why is natural selection not a legitimate mechanism within the framework of theistic evolution? So the question I think, Chris, you're asking is going back to why can't God actually create using natural selection? Is that what you're kind of asking? You can give me a thumbs up if that's the case. Okay. So I think it goes back to, as a principle, we don't know what the principle actually is, right? So in other words, if I'm going to base my, I'll call it my theology, my philosophy, whatever it is, on that as one of my founding principles, well, you gotta define it as a principle first, what it actually means. Does that make sense? All right, other questions? All right, one of you guys want to pray? And we will call it a night.